Hello everybody. Just grab everyone's attention for a quick second. Hello, my name's Hanny. Thank you so much everybody for coming on down for Mr. Hugh Kelly presenting the Paragon Elevated with Species, or something around those lines. Just a quick housekeeping. If you haven't got a drink already, go ahead up to Isaac at the bar with the beer taps. There is a bar tap, so like if you do want to have a beer, go ahead. I think there's also some wines. The restrooms are just out the back. And if something bad happens, the door's there. So pretty straightforward, that one. Nothing too bad, yeah. This is the installment number 2. Kelly was in Sydney last night doing this talk. We're really excited to finally have these things happening in Canberra, where it's all started, and we need this big community like seeing you guys all here today to kind of keep these things running. So we thank everybody for their time today. I'll probably just leave it to you, Kelly. We've got some cool coffees coming out too, so take it easy on everything else you put inside. But we will have some brews in a second tasting these really cool new things. Go ahead, Kelly. I'll leave it with you.
Cool. All right. So thanks so much for coming. So this is pretty special to me because it's about a species that's usually sort of swept under the rug. So Liberica, if you're kind of not sure about coffee species in general, you've got Arabica and Robusta. That's majority of what we drink. So Arabica is pretty much all the specialty. But you have all these other coffee species. So Arabica is sort of an umbrella term. You have all these varieties underneath it. So if you think about wine, you've got Chardonnay, Shiraz, Riesling, all these different varieties of a grape. But when you change species, you're changing category. So Liberica is a species of coffee, so Coffea liberica, and it's been, I guess, swept under the rug because of polarizing flavor profiles. So this one's special to me because I served this coffee at the World Barista Championships in Milan. And this was the first time I know that this coffee was served at these competitions. And people were looking at me like I was a little crazy for serving it because of strange flavor profiles. So a little bit about Liberica as a species. It's totally different to Arabica. Arabica, you can see that's a little branch on the left. You can see the leaves are yay big. Your Liberica tree, it's huge. It's like a totally different thing. Liberica is completely different in tree structure, in cherry structure, and in the way it tastes. Now the reason why I selected Liberica, and I served this as a milk coffee, was because of aromatic intensity. And you'll kind of learn a little bit about this species as we go. Then I'm going to tie this species into the Paragon brewer, give you a little bit of theory there. We're going to be able to taste side by side the impacts that the brewing and the processing and all that sort of stuff has had on that species. And I'm like super excited about the direction of this moving forward for the future. It's something that, you're tasting one of maybe 30 kilos of coffee ever produced in this way of Liberica. And we're going to be getting hopefully between 300 and 500 kilos of a similar process this year to be able to start actually serving more in cafes, having releases, and be able to refine it even more. So it's a super exciting thing. So a little bit to start with. Liberica is probably the most aromatically intense coffee I've ever tasted. So you grind this coffee in a room and you'll smell it down the hallway. It's not always a positive aroma or flavor that you're getting. So the first versions we tasted were intense umami. So we've had smoked meats, we've had blue cheese, durian, bin juice, everything very, very unusual. But one thing's for certain is it's always had super intense aroma. It's always had some kind of tropical element there, whether that's a positive or negative. And also big texture and sweetness. So it is a super unique coffee, and you'll taste that in some of these brews. But to start off, if you have a look at on the right-hand side, the Arabica, you can see that root system. It's a lot shallower than the Liberica. So the Liberica goes a lot deeper. we don't have to go into specifics here, but this is giving you a bit of an idea of through the different soil layers that you get different amino acids, you get different minerals, you get a whole lot of different things for that tree to feed on. So you kind of think of it as more layers of soil, more complexity of flavor. So if you're looking within just Arabica at the same farm, if you have really fluffy soil and the root system is able to get a bit deeper, you will get more complexity and more colors of flavor profile from that tree compared to something with compacted soil where the roots only get a little bit more shallow. But then when you change species, the whole root structure and the whole system completely changes. So these Liberica trees, they're heaps thicker trunk. The way that tree is structured is completely different, and those roots get super deep. So I've had everything in terms of flavor profile from Liberica, from blueberries to strawberry to all sorts of florals to tropicals to salami and the cheeses. But yeah, it's really that the ability to develop flavor intensity and aromatic intensity is there because we're starting at soil and we have ability to build that from soil. So it's a pretty interesting place to start. There are some challenges with Liberica. So these are borer beetles. This is a big issue through coffee in general. So I know in Timor-Leste, for example, it's been huge issues last year with PNG in places with huge borer beetle infestation. They eat the coffee cherries and they render them pretty useless. Liberica is high sugar, so the cherry structure is completely different and the beetles just love to go for it. So what's really interesting is in India, these coffees are actually being planted around the outside of their Arabica coffees to attract these borer beetles to them and not get their Arabicas, which are the things that are more valuable apparently. So that's kind of the treatment it's had, because when you get a bad version, and the first ones that I tasted, they are weird. They're super, super weird. I won't give you the really, really weird ones. Tonight we'll give you a more refined version. But that's one of those indications of, Liberica, it's been there, it's growing through Asia. I mean, it originated more in Liberia, Western Africa, spread through a lot of Asia. So you've got, Philippines. This one's from Malaysia, from my Liberica. And yeah, these coffees are growing commercially, but we haven't been drinking them. So that for me was a really interesting one. And it was a big motivation to try and work with this coffee and try to strip some of the negatives out and to just highlight the qualities that I wanted. So we'll kind of go through a little bit of how we did that as well. So this was one of the first steps. Jason was hanging a lot of these on each tree. They've got some of the hormones, I think it's like pheromones and the sugars in there in that little solution. All those borer beetles are getting attracted through the little slots and they're ending up in the sugar. So he reduced dramatically the number of beans lost, which was really important because the yield that you get from a coffee cherry of Liberica is a lot lower than Arabica. You get a lot of cherries off a tree, similar to Arabica, but just the amount of fruit and the amount of weight in skin and sugar and all that sort of stuff is completely different. So Arabica is on the right. So you can see that skin is sort of flexible and it's a lot thinner. And then the sugar, you can kind of see through it. So the Liberica, it's sort of like a pod. It almost looks like a cocoa pod in a way. It's a lot more fibrous. It's a lot thicker. And then you can see the sugar, it is super, super thick. So you're getting 2-3 times the amount of mucilage or the sugar layer around the bean comparing with Arabica. So that's kind of showing that these cherries are built for fermentation. Like we want to allow microbes to do their thing because they've got so much more sugar to break down. So a lot of like carbonic maceration coffees that you might have tasted in cafes or natural process coffees might be pushed in fermentation extended periods. So we're talking like sort of that 6 to maybe 10 days for a long ferment. They're developing a lot of flavor profile. They're breaking down a lot of that sugar. But with Liberica, it's not even near the starting point. So we had to completely change the way everything was done and how we thought about Liberica from farm level. So one of the things Jason's done is bought cherry color sorter. So we have a lot of humidity in Malaysia. So there's a lot of ability for unwanted microbes to get on there and to start rotting things, start developing flavors that we don't want. So one of the big challenges was getting cherries in, getting them sorted and getting them into a tank as fast as possible. So if we weren't expediting that process and really getting that quick sorting and then getting it in, we're getting more rotten flavors. So he's able to scale up some of his production with this. So this would be the first pass. He'd put that same, there are your seconds on the side. He'd put that back through the machine at a more refined setting a second time, and you'd get really well sorted cherries. So that improved that quality a fair bit already. So previously the cherries were coming in. Some of them were sitting in these open baskets for sometimes up to a few days. And those coffees, depending on how long they sat there, they'd get more and more rotten in flavor, and the outcomes were not as consistent. So then we, very luckily, Project Origin, super generous through support of Jason. We built an indoor fermentation sort of setup, air conditioning, the whole thing, and set up the barrels because of really unusual temperature fluctuations in that region compared to others. So we had to get some kind of control in ferments. So we were putting barrels inside. This here is a lactic culture. So did a bit of work with a microbiology company in Denmark. And this is a lactic culture that they spray on Christmas hams. They're using heaps of different industries to bioprotect food ingredients. They're starting to use it in the wine industry. They're using it in the brewing industry for really fast conversion of sugars to lactic acid. So a lot of sour beers are being made with this to get a really clean, really consistent ferment. So we're using this lactic culture. We weren't using any yeasts. Usually you use yeast to build more flavor. That's maybe the goal of adding these yeasts. But bacteria was more to just clean up the flavor profile as much as possible, avoid as many bad things happening. So we added lactic culture, so whole cherries go in. But then we were pushing these ferments and we had no idea how long we needed to do that for. This was a 10-day ferment. So we've stripped the cherry skin off, and you can see the sugar's still completely intact. So it's not coming off like you might expect a 10-day ferment to happen. And what would usually happen with the Arabica, you'd be able to rub them like marbles and the sugar would come off. This was still a thick layer, and it smelled like it wasn't fermented. So we were like, don't know what's going on. Started pushing longer and longer and longer, and the flavor profile started to get better and better and better. So we know when we do just a normal process where we just get cherries, dry them in the sun, or strip the strip the skin off, give it a wash and dry it, flavor profile was still strange, and we're getting that sort of cedar, woody characteristic, dominating fruit quality, and a very strange botanical herbal quality. But when we were putting more process on it, it was sort of offsetting some of these flavors. And there's more refinement that we're going to be doing later in the year when I go to do some harvest with him in person. But everything was completely different, completely unusual. Might get you to start on the first brews as well. So we're going to start tasting the first brew in a minute as well of this. So another huge challenge. Like I said, Malaysia has really high humidity. So basically when you have high humidity, you've got the sort of water content that can sit on the cherries. That can cause more fruit rot. This is a huge issue in places like Colombia, Honduras, some origins more than others. But Malaysia, this was a good day. This is 77% humidity. It can go up to around that 90% at night, which is super dangerous. So on the right-hand side, you can see those racks there. We were blowing fans over them to try and wick some of that moisture off. There's just nothing we could do. That was all mold cover, that white stuff. So this was the first lots that we'd done, which was a big shame. They were super, super meaty. And it's really funny, we're actually getting some of these lots and turning them into a brisket pie with 3 mil soon. So it's going to be a good use of a product that didn't quite go right. But we had to really think about the drying as a means of cleaning up flavor profile and getting what we wanted out of the coffee. So with PO, we invested in, Project Origin invested in a drying house. So this was essential. This is where the coffee took quite a big step up in quality. So we controlled the ferment, closing everything in a sealed tank, putting the culture on it to try and bioprotect as much as possible over a really long time. So some of these are 20-day ferments, which is really long for coffee. And then taking them out and placing them in this house, which basically the side windows can open up. You've got fans here and you've got dehumidifiers. And this can help regulate that humidity and help to control that drying. So we weren't getting any of that mold layer on the coffee anymore. So this was another step in refining the Liberica. So super, super important, and super grateful to Project Origin for investing in that with Jason. The amazing thing is, so the start conversations I had with Jason was all over WhatsApp. This was start of the pandemic. I wasn't able to travel, and we had a number of meetings about how we wanted to try and elevate Liberica and do all these things. And when you have Liberica and you only get 5% of the end green bean or unroasted coffee weight out of the cherry, comparing with Arabica, you're getting like 15 to 17%. You get a lot less coffee from each cherry. So the concern is, the labor costs, the viability of this. So it was, I don't know if we can add all these steps and all these layers for something that people don't appreciate or enjoy. But now, this year, he's just built his second dry house and is expanding his ferment rooms. So he's completely changed his attitude towards, and I'm not saying that he was always can do with everything, and he was amazing to work with, but now he believes in the future of Liberica as a premium product and something that can be actually amazing. And the goal with this project is we want to scale this up. We want to start buying cherries from producers around as well, and then start to process more and more, and a bit of education in how this coffee can be worked with. And I'll touch on that a little bit once we get into a little bit of tasting as well, where we'll bring in the Paragon. But for me, this is, we're sort of at the beginning. We've taken a few steps, but there's a long way to go with Liberica. And I don't really want to see more trees being ripped out of the ground, because we need biodiversity. If we just rely on Arabica with shallow root systems and it's not able to deal with drought or high rainfall. An example, in Uganda at a farm, there was Arabica trees that, with heaps of rain in this last year, they were down 80% production. But the Liberica, with the deeper root systems, the cherries that didn't fall off the trees, they were actually able to maintain their production. So 80% drop, maintaining. So that's just one instance of species being able to sort of resist climate change, give us a little bit more diversity to work with. And you've also got that root system. People are starting to graft Arabica coffees to those root systems and getting better results with flavour, which is a really, really interesting thing as well. So I see massive value in Liberica as well. So one thing with Liberica that is very different, so we sent coffees off to Zurich University of Applied Science, and they do a lot of coffee testing. And this is a few different species here. You don't have to worry too much about details, but you've got basically Arabica here, and the orange there, that's your chlorogenic acid. So chlorogenic acid, it makes coffee, if you're not preparing it right or roasting it right, is what can make coffee taste like battery acid. It is a super aggressive, harsh acid that's it's resistant to, it's a sort of defense mechanism against insects. So Arabica's got quite a lot. Canephora or Robusta is a little bit more than Arabica as well, so a little bit more harsh, a little bit more rough. But then you see Liberica here, it's much lower. So that's the second on the right. The Eugenioides, which I use for espresso, is even lower again. But when we have that lower chlorogenic acid, you have less chance of getting sourness. You get generally a smoother texture, and you often get more sweetness as well in the coffees. So one of the things that was always in the Libericas, even with, if you just try to switch your brain off to strange flavor profiles, it was always thick in texture. It was always very round, and it was always very smooth. We haven't quite got it yet to the point where we can run it as a straight espresso, because you condense that intensity of flavor down, and it's a bit polarizing. It's a bit much, but it doesn't matter what you do with it. You can run that as espresso, and it'll always be smooth, and it'll always be very coating. So you get a massive tactile benefit from this species. So roasting is a whole different thing. Danny Wilson, head roaster at ONA, he's gone super deep with Liberica. You can see the beans are massive. They are completely different structure to other coffees. And usually when you're roasting a coffee, they'll get to a point of first crack where they'll pop, and that gives you some sort of indication of, so once they crack, people are often measuring the time after crack as a bit of a guide for how they roast coffees with their styling. So let's just say 10% development time would be 10% of that overall roast time is spent after crack. So usually coffees are sort of within a similar box of the temperature at which they crack, but Liberica, we have to pull it out a lot earlier than any other Arabica coffee cracks. So we were roasting coffees, looking at them going, oh, it's super light and we don't know why, it doesn't look right and it doesn't taste right. Because we're pushing them darker, maybe because of the original lots weren't so great. But we're pushing more roast with these and starting to bring them to a roast color that looked a bit more like what we're used to. And the coffees were getting worse and we didn't know why. So it was super confusing until we started to get some of the later lots and pulling back on that roast and going lighter in color. They were being more fruity, they were being more lifted. There was less of that meaty and like tobacco smoky characteristic in the coffees. So we had to kind of think about it completely differently. It's really interesting, the coffee you're going to taste now is designed for, it was originally designed to be run as a milk coffee. Still really nice as a milk coffee, but then we realized we're roasting this coffee so light and so fast that we tried brewing it on filter and it worked there as well. So we didn't have to worry about, with a really light, really fast roast, if we were to do that with another species, it'd be really sour. So you get that puckering, really like lemon juice sourness, it'd be super rough, you wouldn't have enough sweetness. But with Liberica, we actually could go to areas that we couldn't do with Arabica. So whole adjustment there, and that's definitely another reason why I'm sure people have tried Libericas before and gone, I hate this is weird, I don't want to drink it anymore. So Danny Wilson done absolute magic with the roasting of this, and then as we progress with the fermentation, we know that the roasting's in a nice box, so we can actually properly judge it. This is a really challenging part when you're trying to analyze a coffee for how it's processed at a farm, and you don't know if the roast is right or whether that's impacting the flavor profile. So yeah, so the first coffees that are coming around, this is without Paragon. So like think of this as the control. So I'll talk a little bit about Paragon and how this started, and it'll start to provide a bit of context for the second coffee. But a few things I want you to look out for with this brew is the heaviness on the palate. When it finishes on the back of the palate, do you get any kind of grip, or do you get any of the sort of tannins that sort of grip on? And then also think about the acidity level. How much acid, how much brightness is there? Is there a lot? Is there not enough? Is it going to the back of your palate, or is it front palate and lifted and more vibrant and fruity? So just sort of think about those few elements when you taste this one. This will kind of be your reference point for the second coffee, and hopefully you'll see a difference. So this is where the idea of Paragon comes in. So originally when I started working on sort of coffee species, I was working with Eugenioides, which is a different coffee species again, very low acid, and it was, again, very polarizing flavor profile. So it had these sort of seaweed qualities. Sometimes it was cheesy. There was some of these cereal notes as well. Very, very, very strange coffee. And it did always have hints of tropicals, but I couldn't ever get them out through roast profile, extraction, or any of that sort of stuff. So I started blending different coffees in to see if I could sort of bring a little bit of acidity to balance the bitterness and the sweetness, and also hopefully lift up a little bit of fruit as well. But when I added wash coffees, they didn't kind of change that flavor profile enough. But when I added something like a anaerobic natural process coffee, so whole cherries go into a tank, they'll ferment and then dried as a natural in the cherry, you should get more of these fruity characteristics. They would start to adjust the flavor profile. And as I added more and more and more of this coffee in, so I was going 1 gram, 1.5, 2 grams, 2.5 into the eugenioides. Eventually the coffee would go from seaweed. Suddenly, like when I went 3 grams to 3.5, there was this tipping point, and the coffee would just go from seaweed to passion fruit. And it was like, you literally flicked a switch and it changed dramatically. So this is down to volatile aroma compounds. And this is kind of the reason why I started with Liberica, looking at adjusting what was there to try and unlock the positive flavors and to cover up the negative flavors. So don't worry too much about details here, but coffee has a huge amount of aroma volatile compounds that are responsible for different flavors. And it's super complex the way this works, but if you might have in one coffee a compound that gives you, bin juice or smelly socks or cheese or whatever that is, very strange flavor profiles. You might get in the same coffee other compounds that might give you, strawberry notes or, candy fruits or citrus or florals. They'll all be there, but they're in varying intensities. And if the intensity of the compound isn't high enough, you don't actually taste that flavor. So it's all about the balance. So let's just say there's too much of these weird compounds, it can cover up fruit. Doesn't mean it's not there. It's sort of like a magician doing a magic trick. There's things going on down there, but they're drawing your attention up here so you don't see it. That's sort of the idea of how this works. And this was super interesting to me because this allows us to think about flavor profiles and manipulation in a very different way. So we got in contact with Zurich University, started going really deep on understanding volatile aroma compounds and trying to understand how we could manipulate them and how we could adjust those. So we won't go too much depth here, but basically when we change extraction temperature, we don't actually change the amount of coffee we extract, but we dramatically change the volatile compounds that we access and that we have in the cup. So there's a whole lot of chemicals that are in the liquid, but it's really the volatile compounds that change. So don't worry, it gets a little bit too scientific and hectic, but basically where we ended up was running espresso over frozen metal rocks to chill that espresso as soon as it came out of the spouts. And if you think about like blanching as an example, if you shock chill something, you don't release as many of those fresher compounds in a coffee or in that ingredient. Think similar to cold press juicing, you get that freshness, you preserve some of those volatile compounds. So it's very linked to heat. So if we ran a liquid onto a frozen metal rock, which we tried originally with the eugenioides, coffee completely changed. It was more alive, it was brighter, there was more fruitiness, there was more delicate kind of qualities. We went, really, really crazy on this. Sasha and I and one of the guys who's in Queensland with us as well, Fabian, we spent 3 days in lockdown tasting espresso after espresso after espresso blind to see if it wasn't just a psychological thing. And we gathered heaps of data and we were like, no, this is definitely doing something. So then we got in contact with Professor Chahan in Zurich University, and they started doing a lot of testing on what happens when you chill coffee liquid when you extract it, rather than just allowing it to run through the air, be hot and release everything. So he found the very beginning of the extraction, you're losing the majority of your volatile compounds. So the first 10 seconds. So if you see along that axis here, the time, 0 to 10 seconds, that's the majority of what we have. When you run the rest of that liquid, you're kind of losing less and less because most of it's already been released. So it's that initial stage that has so much there and we have so much potential to lose. And we're just losing that and losing a lot of those aroma compounds that could give us more fruitiness or the positives that we kind of want. So a little bit more science there, but general idea is most of it's in that first stage. So from here, so we might get started on the second lot as well. So from here, we started running more tests. So we started off with espresso. We were seeing all the volatile compound changes from the chilling. And we're finding that some compounds that are really easy to release, we're getting sometimes 40% more. So if you think about, it's all about the balancing act. If you just get a tiny bit more of something, it can suddenly unlock a flavor profile that you might not have tasted before. And this was happening with my espresso. I was getting suddenly more passion fruit, more tropicals. I was getting less of the herbal notes from that particular coffee. So this is where I was kind of thinking about Liberica. It was you have a lot of strange things, and you have these positive, brighter things that we kind of want to draw attention to try and offset some of the, and I'm sure you might have tasted some of these almost savory elements in that first coffee. They'll probably still be there a little bit, but you're going to get a little bit more of these other compounds that will draw your attention away from them a bit more. You get more fruit, more lift, and it'll be a different experience. So we were seeing basically chemically chilling the extract that comes out will systematically increase the amount of aroma and flavour in a coffee. So they did heaps and heaps of repetitions. This was the first testing for filter coffee when Sasha was doing Brewer's Cup last year. And we were finding with filter coffee is actually really amazing because filter coffee you roast a little bit lighter, so you have more volatile aroma compounds present. You're not roasting them out of the coffee, comparing with like espresso or milk where you're roasting a bit more. So it was amazing. We were seeing these really big increases in these compounds. And Sasha did a Brewer's Cup routine, and you have a compulsory round where everyone has the same coffee, and he brewed it with this extract chilling technique, and the judges didn't believe that it was the same coffee. They were like, they weren't sure whether he'd spiked it or done something to the brew, because they're like, we haven't tasted this all day, there's something else in here. And in the end, he had to get the equipment out and show them, and then they were like, okay. we just hadn't tasted that coffee as it is. So it's going to be really interesting with Liberica, because Liberica, we don't have that chlorogenic acid there, so we don't have as much acid to draw our attention towards those fruit characters. So we need help with vibrancy, with delicate stuff, with lift in the cup profile. So we're definitely going to see quite a big improvement with this, I hope. So what Mitch is doing right now, I don't know if anyone can see him over there on the bar. I'm putting the pressure on. But basically he's got 3 Paragon brewers. A gentleman here from Formswell actually designed them. Super cool to have them here from just around the corner. So yeah, we approached them to start working on a brewing device. And basically you can see there's a frozen metal rock underneath the brew. And then the pour over is going to be done straight onto the rock. And the amount of pours, so they're going to be adding 5 pours to the coffee. And the number of pours that you add allows you to manipulate the amount that you're preserving in the coffee, the amount that you're trying to avoid losing. So different coffees like different amounts of chilling. So there's not really a hard and fast rule with this. Different roasting styles need different amounts of chilling. But usually for a lot of Arabica coffees, we're just chilling the first 1 or 2 pours, because that's got more of those aroma volatile compounds. But generally when we chill more and more and more pours, we are increasing vibrancy. So we're drawing our attention towards acid more and more and more, which is really interesting. But you will get that perception of sweetness because of those aroma compounds. So the way we taste, if you taste something like with vanillin in it, for example, your brain associates vanillin with a memory, and that usually is associated with an experience from that compound. So let's just say you have vanillin, you think of vanilla ice cream, you think of sweet, creamy things. And if you get a beverage with vanillin in it, your brain might not have sweetness and creaminess there, but it kind of puts together and pieces together that information with your past memory, and it can make things taste sweeter and can make things taste different in their structure. So what you're going to taste here is more of certain compounds. So it's going to change the way the coffee flows across the palate, how the acidity presents itself or how the bitterness presents itself. It's not actually changing the amount of dissolved compounds that give you bitterness or acidity. You're not increasing acidity or decreasing it. Just the compounds are drawing your attention to different parts. So for Liberica, for example, we have that lower chlorogenic acid. And we need more vibrancy to draw our attention away from some of the sort of more polarizing elements. So by chilling more pours, so we're doing actually every single pour over the ice rock here. Doesn't work with a lot of coffees, but with Liberica, it seems to work really well. And I'm sure there's other coffees with slightly lower acid that you need more acid or more vibrancy to sort of adjust. But it kind of works really well for this one. So it's looking like the brews are getting pretty close to finished. But yeah, so basically this is a product that Sasha used at Brewers Cup last year. And he was using a geisha from Iris Estate, one of his farms, and that coffee was the most intense, like Turkish delight, rosy, floral thing I've ever tasted in my life. Oh, thanks. And yeah, it's crazy how much it sort of elevates that sort of thing. So it's giving brewers more control over the way they brew. It's allowing us to manipulate coffees in different ways. So I might not want to, for example, change the brew temperature to get more acidity. If you might increase brew temperature to get more acidity, but it might bring other negatives. So instead I might keep my brew temperature the same, add more chilling to the brew, and then I get more vibrancy without bringing these negatives and tannins and things from that lower density coffee. So this coffee is grown super low altitude. It's 0 to 20 meters above sea level. So like Arabica is you're usually seeing 1,500, 1,800 meters above sea level. We don't have a huge amount of space to be growing coffee that high. So something like Liberica that can handle these lower grown conditions are super important for our future. And being able to actually get the best out of them, being able to lift their vibrancy without bringing out the tannins from that a low grown coffee you will usually give at a high temperature brew is something that it's super cool. And I hope you can taste the difference. It should be coming around pretty soon. But yeah, I'm gonna have a taste. So the first one definitely is gonna be on the heavier side of the spectrum, probably a little bit more tannin in the back of the palate. This coffee, you're definitely gonna get a little bit more elevated acid, which is a real benefit to this. The last one wouldn't have had enough vibrancy to sort of balance it. Oh, he's brewed it better than me. So yeah, this will draw attention a little bit more to some of your tropical notes. You should get like a little bit of this kind of papaya quality, maybe a little bit of almost like banana in there as well. Some of this red fruit as well. It's going to be more lifted, but then think about the texture. It's going to be smoother than the last one because you have better balance between sweetness, acidity, and bitterness. So it'll be a little bit thicker on the palate in perception and be a bit smoother in the way it transitions. It's pretty crazy when you run a little bit of coffee over a frozen metal rock, what that can do to the flavor profile. So yeah, I hope you can taste the difference. I'm really curious to see if anyone has any other comments that I haven't made on what they taste. But yeah, thanks so much for coming. I hope you enjoy the brew. Paragons are, we only have a few here. Paragons are available for sale here and in all of our cafes and online. And in the future as well, keep an eye out for more Liberica releases. So when the next harvest comes in, we should have a little bit more quantity. We're going to be doing some milk-based releases, some filter releases, and we'll have more Liberica available on our cafes. We're going to be doing more work on blending to get the best out of it. But these coffees are definitely very unique in their flavor profile. I think it's super interesting and I think it's got a great future. So yeah, thanks so much. So,
anyone want any more? Yeah. I won't spare you.
So I've just thrown a lot of information at you in a short period of time. If anyone's actually retained any of that, I was going to see if anyone had any questions. Or we can just hang out after and you can ask them in a more casual way.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
So when it does come to retail, what is the pricing like?
The pricing of Liberica at the moment is higher than Arabica. But the way I look at it is its value is in blending. So definitely, we have actually blended a little bit of another coffee into here because by itself, it doesn't ever express as well as if you find a nice partner. So my best suggestion is, so we've done 30 or 40% of a natural geisha in here to offset some of those flavors. So you're getting more tropicals. You can kind of skew that flavor profile where you want, depending on what you blend it with. So we did a milk-based release was in MICE at the end of last year, was a coffee expo, and we did 20% into other coffees, and people still taste the Liberica. It's so aromatic and it's so intense, but it rounds out everything else. So it was like kind of like a Bailey's Irish cream banana milk based, which is super cool. So you're able to mitigate a bit of the cost by blending. So that's where I see its big value. Something like Eugenoides as well, where there's only a handful of farms or 2 farms in the world right now growing it commercially. Everybody wants it. Everybody's ready to throw big money at it. So the only benefit, or the only real viable way to do it is add 10% to another coffee to round out its sweetness or whatever. So that's the way I see species starting. But then as we work with them more and more, as we plant more, we should be able to find methods to make it more viable. So yeah, work in progress. Cool. We might, we've got more food, we've got more drinks. I'm gonna hang around. If you've got any other questions that pop up afterwards, feel free to ask. But otherwise, thanks so much for coming. I hope you found that interesting. Hope you like the coffee as well. It's super cool to see a coffee like this not being tasted and people screwing up their face and going, I don't know what this is. So the first coffees I gave of this to our roast team, who are used to being able to adjust the roast profile to get the qualities they want out of coffee, they were looking at me like I was crazy. But now there's company-wide respect for these coffees, and I'm hoping that we're going to get worldwide respect for these coffees in the future. So thanks so much for coming.